All right, what's up, Gromies? Welcome to Arroyo Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Keisha, and this is episode 106. Shout out to our live viewers on Hangout, on YouTube and Instagram, to everyone tapping in on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you for your support. And if you like the pod, drop us a review. We absolutely appreciate your feedback. Seth, holding it down solo today. How you doing, my friend?
Not too bad, Keisha. How about you today?
I'm doing good. It's good to
Good.
see you. We got some great questions in the bank, and I know some live ones will probably be rolling up. So let's just get into it, shall we? This seemed like a really good one to start with, especially lately. We've been talking a lot about pH. Spencer dropped this question. They wanted to know, can you go over the relationship between runoff EC and pour water EC and how that relates to runoff pH and the pH of your substrate?
Yeah, so if we're looking at pour water EC versus runoff EC, there's a few things to take into consideration. So, number one, are we slowly reaching field capacity without pushing any channeling before we reach that? Because if you're irrigating too much, a lot of times you're pushing water through too fast. Once the block hits a certain saturation point, water will tend to conduct down through the media without homogenizing with the nutrient solution within. So when we're looking at that, like let's say my goal is to go get a runoff sample today, and I just push, a 12-minute feed to accomplish that, my runoff sample is probably going to actually come back for pH and EC very close, maybe slightly elevated from what my feed EC and pH would be. If we're looking at slowly bringing that up to field capacity over 1 to 2 hours and actually getting runoff at the end of that field capacity when it's homogenized, our runoff EC will be slightly different than the pour water EC, a little lower, a little higher sometimes. And that's a good reflection. But in terms of pH, what we're looking at is that ratio between positive and negative ions. So when we're looking at a plant that's, feeding well, we should see in that runoff EC and pH, a slight drift, sometimes a little bit down on the EC versus pour water. And then oftentimes a little, 0.1 to 0.3 pH difference. If I went in at a 5.9, I would expect a healthy plant to be feeding and giving me a runoff pH of 5.5 to 5.7. And that's just because, we're looking at that positive and negative balance, and we're only pulling the negative out of it, which is making the solution more positive. And in this case, some of the ions we're looking at aren't just hydrogen ions, they're other positively charged ions in solution. So as we adjust that pH is going to start to fall. And that's part of why we, usually discuss looking at 5 to 15% runoff. That's generally an amount to replace that nutrient balance and maintain pH. And pH is a big indicator of what the balance of nutrients is, or actually is inside of the root zone, because, we don't have a sensor that we stick in there to look at, how much actual plant available elements or plant essential elements it's pulling out. So at the end of the day, the relationship that we're looking for is looking and seeing, okay, are we getting adequate EC in our runoff? If I don't have a root zone sensor, I want to make sure that, hey, I'm hitting 3 to 4.0 in my runoff, 1500 to 2000 ppm. Going higher all the way up to 4000 is not uncommon. And then in pH, really just don't want to see that to start to drift. If it's going, if I'm reliably putting in at 5.9, coming out at 5.6, that's great. What you'll tend to find is if you don't push runoff for, like, let's say a week at a time, when you do push runoff, now, a lot of times you're going to see your pH come back and your runoff pH come back at like 5.2, 5.0. And once we've drifted down to that point, really restricted nutrient availability to the plant on all levels, especially our NPK. So as far as that relationship goes, one of the best things you can do is make sure that you're actually achieving field capacity before you get runoff. And a great way to do this is to go look at your P1 series and say, hey, I've calculated that over these 5 shots, I'm going to add 600 milliliters. And my goal is to not get any runoff until I've actually added that 600 milliliters or very close to it. If my last shot is 80 milliliters, that's where I want to see the runoff. If I go in and watch that P1 cycle and I'm starting to see runoff, after the second irrigation, that's when I'll pull back on that irrigation duration and potentially space the irrigation shots out just a little bit, maybe take it from 15 to 20 minutes in the spacing to give that volume of water a little more time to wick around the media and homogenize. And like I said, if you're seeing that runoff, or we'll call it actually channeling, during that P1 cycle, that's just designed to slow down your irrigations and make sure that you're actually getting good water use efficiency on these plants, so that we know, like, hey, we're not pushing water straight through and not giving it a chance to make any effect on the root zone.
Appreciate that overview, Seth. Spencer, we appreciate your question. Thank you for asking it. Okay, so you kind of answered this question, but let's bring it home. We got this from Nick. Nick wrote, when crop steering a medium in generative phase, should we be aiming for runoff every day? Or is it okay if we get close to field capacity, but not quite hit runoff?
So, I mean, this is where the situation comes in. That's, do you have time series data monitoring in your root zone or not? Because if we can look at the EC in the actual root zone, we can make better decisions about whether or not we want to push runoff that day or not. My general rule of thumb is I don't like to go more than 3 days without runoff, because typically on that third day, I'll start to see a pH drift downward. If I push it out to a week, that might be when we're hitting that 5.2 or so runoff. And at that point, we're probably going to see some plant health symptoms. Not 100% of the time, but there's a good chance that that's what we're going to see. So you need runoff. Basically, that's the whole drained away system. Like we're replacing, an important thing to remember here is whenever we're using salts, we're operating in a hydroponic system. We have very, very good control over our inputs and using those inputs to manipulate what the outputs in terms of runoff should be. And in that situation, we always want to be replacing that nutrient balance, and pH is our indicator that we're actually back in balance, because that's the easiest thing we can measure. Rather, the other option is to take a runoff sample and go into a lab and try to analyze what's in it. Most of us don't have a lab that's capable of doing that, and it's cost prohibitive compared to just using pH as your indicator for nutrient balance.
Awesome. All right. And then thank you, Nick, for your question. So I'm moving on to this next question. I love it when the questions are all kind of related. This one came from Terp Fiends TDX. So they wrote, I can't get my EC to drop below 5.5 to 6.6 after my P1, input around 4, getting plenty of runoff. Am I channeling? How do I correct if I do need correction?
If you can't get your EC down, one thing obviously is to lower your feed EC a little bit. And push some runoff. And then, like I said, just watch that P1 series. You should be able to time your irrigations and your irrigation volumes to a point where when you're going to get runoff. If we are getting channeling, if I have a 5 irrigation series for my P1, or let's say an 8, and I get, runoff at 4, that means I'm channeling because I'm seeing that runoff happen before I've actually hit field capacity in terms of volumetric water content. So if my media were to hydrate up to a 65%, like a lot of the finer ground cocos out there, or rock wool, and I see runoff coming out after that 4th irrigation and they've only hit, let's say, 52%, then I know, okay, that's too big of an irrigation, too fast. I need to slow it down, space it out, and figure out what this media can take. In a perfect world, if we wanted to go as generative as possible, we'd have, a big pot and one big irrigation every morning, and that's it. But the reason we go with a P1 series is because we're working with pots that are small enough that we want to be able to actually achieve a decent dryback in the daytime and bulk those plants during mid-flower. If we had too big of a pot, we don't get enough dryback during the daytime to actually bulk those without just keeping them highly and possibly oversaturated. So that's where some of this irrigation calculation comes in. If I've got a 1 gallon pot, I can't put nearly as big of an irrigation on that without channeling as I could, let's say, a 3 or a 5 gallon pot. However, because I'm getting that daytime dry back, getting enough air into the root zone, I'm able to hit those successive P2 irrigations and steer the plant towards more of a bulking behavior. So that's really the big thing to keep in mind when we're looking at these generative irrigations. Is like the extreme would be, one really big irrigation, feed it everything at once, and then, give it the longest time between pushing oxygen to the root zone and forcing respiration more and more. When we don't do that, we're not going to see that bulking behavior. That's why, historically, if you've grown a 5 or 7 or 10 gallon pot, you were able to produce some very quality flower, especially if you have good genetics, but the yield would leave something to be desired. And, it wasn't something that was quite as important until we've seen, commercial growing and commoditization of prices. So that's where we've got to kind of look and go, and that's where we're seeing too, some of these, older genetics that are a little more finicky and want to be steered super generatively their whole life cycle are tough to grow in a commercial situation, because we're trying to balance like, hey, we've got a genetic that we've, selected over several generations, the last 20 years, to produce a specific nose and a specific cannabinoid profile, but usually weren't selecting for yield or ease of growth. And so now when we see like, hey, if you've got a plant that is difficult and you blow it up to, let's say, 2,000, 5,000 square feet in one room, now it's a lot tougher to manage that plant. And that's where we're seeing, kind of a little bit of traditional ag approach is in terms of genetics coming in and saying, hey, you've got a facility or a farm that is most profitable when it's producing a certain type of genetic, because that genetic grows to the best of its potential inside of those parameters. And then once you start planning a business around that, you've really got to evaluate like, hey, if I'm going to grow a strain, I know that I need, based on pricing, X amount of grams per square foot. Can that strain deliver it? And can it deliver it in the same growing environment as other strains? So using lemon cherry gelato, for example, the best yields and some of the best, cannabinoid testing I've seen come from people deciding to monocrop that strain, because the market potential's there. Depending on what state you're in, and what, brokers and dispensaries you're working with, you might get a pretty hefty premium for the lemon cherry gelato. But when you try to grow it with some other strains under the same program, you might see, 1.8 to 2.5 pounds per light as a metric. Whereas if we can monocrop that strain and not have to have it in the exact same conditions and same timeline as some other strains, we can start to see that 3.4 to 3.8 pounds of light. So a lot of it just comes down to business planning and really, evaluating your return on investment. So if I put, 2 out of the 8 benches in one room into lemon cherry gelato, but I decide to do it under all the same conditions as I did with Oreos next to it, which is, a quicker flowering strain, much easier to grow, I would expect that I'm not going to get the best performance out of that lemon cherry gelato. And that's really, one thing that's tough for growers, because, as impassioned individuals, I mean, one thing that I always love about the cannabis industry is most of the growers I work with are very passionate about the actual plants they're growing, whereas when we blow it up to very big scale ag, you're much more looking at like how much money you can pull out of that area of land. Right. And because it's, kind of completely opposite and more passion driven, we as growers tend to try to want to grow the things we want to grow. And then we've also got to deal with the market. Unfortunately, the market's driven by a lot of different factors, whether it's music, social media, name all the different media channels you can find out about new strains and what's going on. That's another aspect that's tough to growers, because sometimes what the consumers want is not what's the best to grow for us. And so it's a fine line, and there's a lot of balance work to do, and it just takes a lot of planning and, unfortunately, a lot of ROI math to figure out if it's actually worth it to grow that strain. And unfortunately, every once in a while you're going to get burned too. Like it's going to happen that if you're cranking through, 80 strains in 5 years, putting them out in the market, there's probably going to be a few that you get that you're late to the game on, and that's just a reality. And that's a constant thing that I think is, number one, tough for growers. And then number two, fortunately, as we're getting farther into the cannabis market, breeders are able to adapt to that and say, okay, there was a period in time where I needed to put out something new like every 3 months. And now we're understanding like, hey, if you can work with some of these lines a little longer, take them out farther in the filial generations, you're going to get better results. It's just adjusting your breeding business strategy to not be putting out strains, on a every couple month basis. You might have a year or two where you really slow down on those releases because you're working on a lot of stuff. But then once you get past that gap, you have enough projects going that now you're back in line to be releasing things on a really regular basis. But from a business perspective, that's tough, right? If you're going to say, hey, we're going to go 2 years without, instead of releasing 5 or 10 strains a year, we're going to release like 1 or 2. And then in 3 or 4 years, we'll be back to our normal cadence. That's certainly a pretty big business challenge if you were to ask me about it. And I don't have a clear-cut answer for that, because it's so dependent on, what your cost to produce is, what state you're in, if you can get a research license, if you've got to take if you've got to take away from production space to do any experimentation, that's also a very hard thing to plan into your business because, hey, most of us want to know, when we put clones in the room, how much money are we going to pull out of it? And it's
Right.
tough.
Yeah. Yeah, this industry is dealing with a lot of considerations that other agricultural industries are not dealing with. Also, cannabis industry, the regulated industry is new. So we're really still learning. This is just the beginning, y'all. So awesome. Seth, thank you so much for that great overview. The live questions are coming in. So
Cool.
let's get to the first one from Instagram. Our friend Tricombe Valley dropped this one. They wrote, I just purchased a Terrace 12 sensor and I'm seeing my pour water EC at 5.5 EC, but my runoff says 9.4 EC with a pH of 6.2. The plant looks quite good, no real burning. What number do I go with? Also, I'm just thinking too that prior to irrigation, I was at 35% volumetric water content and around 9.2 pour water EC. Is the runoff more a reflection of what pour water EC was in the pot prior to irrigation? Thank you times a million. Did you get all that, Seth?
Yeah, for sure. Typically what I go for is looking at the root zone EC because my leachate is going to be a diluted version of what's in my pot. If I've been stacking my EC successfully, like this customer has, I'm going to see, an elevated EC coming out of the bottom of the pot. That being said, that's also going to be diluted by what I put in. So if you're putting it in too fast and we're actually seeing, like, let's say some channeling, then it's not really a reliable number. I always like to look at what's going on in the root zone for EC in that time series so I can say, hey, what is my EC at the wettest point and what are we seeing at that extreme dryback? And, for most sensors out there, what we'll see is at the end of a dryback, especially when it's stacked, and it depends on how much you've stacked up where you start to see that exponential spike on the graph. And actually draw that real quick. If we had, let's say.
Snap. Front row ag whiteboard is coming out, y'all. It's my favorite.
Let's say this is our water line coming in, beginning of the day. Like here's our day mark. A couple hours in, we irrigate. And what we should see is our EC line looking a little more like this. We're going to hit a high point right before we irrigate. And then as we irrigate, we're going to see that come back down and intersect like that. Sorry, I wish I had more colors. We'll do that next time. And, what we should see is at the end of this dryback, and it depends a little bit on what sensing technology you're using. We'll see that EC start to rise. And part of that's because water's leaving the block because the plant's transpiring and we have transpiration. But it's not, if we're stacked up properly, it's not pulling salt out at a rate that's linear compared to our dryback. So at a certain point in the dryback, we actually see the salt ratio compared to water in the pot starts to go up exponentially. And part of that is an artifact of sensing technology. But when we see that, you're usually low enough in a dryback range that we might be approaching temporary wilting point, which once we hit that, in rock wool is much lower. In cocoa, usually somewhere between 12 and 18%. But once we've hit temporary wilting point, we've interrupted that plant's respiration and transpiration process and actually slowed it down. So we've affected a sizable percentage of that plant's life cycle and taken it out of producing plant matter and cannabinoids and forced it to go into, reactionary state. Basically drought response, which the plant's response there, even though it's starting to wilt, it's going to close up its stomata. It's not going to bring up as much water, and it's going to do everything it can to just survive that, pressure difference. So in terms of root zone EC, what I look for in determining when to call my dryback is when my EC line, and with some of the newer sensors, it doesn't spike as high, but usually as we get lower and lower, we'll see it go, almost exponential. And that's where to start calling the end of your dryback in your specific media and stacking situation. You can always push it harder, but if we start to see readings that are really, really high, we know that, hey, we're probably going into a zone of salinity where we're actually going to cause some plant stress. And that's not what we want. We want to guide the plant, not stress it to the point that we see some sort of negative effect on production.
Outstanding. Thank you for that. Tricom Valley, thank you for your question. Good luck and enjoy that Terrace 12. Okay, we got this question from Apex Gardens on Instagram. They're wondering, can you talk about the correlation between bulk EC and poor EC? I know that you can determine poor EC from bulk EC via the Hillhorst model.
Correct, you can. So bulk EC, we're looking at, what is the total saturation there, and then not total saturation, but if I were to be able to pull a sample out of that media and look at the EC there, that's what we're talking about. Pore water EC is what's actually going on in the pores. And that's a really dynamic number over time, because when we've got that nutrient solution in the pores, it's changing constantly every minute. Not massively up and down, but we're either trending upwards or downwards in EC depending on how the plant's feeding and drying back. So pore water EC is ultimately what we want to be looking at, because that's the best representation of what the plant's experiencing. And that is why, like with the T12, we use the Hillhorst model to convert bulk EC into pore water EC, because if you think about how the sensor is inserted into the pot, it's just sensing that water, which technically is a bulk EC measurement. So once we convert that, we've got a much more usable value, and bulk EC is a lot more comparable to leachate EC. It's just not quite as accurate compared to what's going on in the substrate. So pore water EC is really, at the end of the day, what we're looking for, and that's why Arroyo chose to go with that representation using the Hillhorst model rather than just give you bulk EC.
All right. So then, Seth, can we bring it back to, we've had a question about the Terrace 12 sensor. We have the new Terrace 1. Let's bring it back to talking about our sensor technology. How does it work in relation to pore water EC, and why is it so much more accurate than what else is out there?
So when we look at how we sense some of this stuff, we're using dielectric permittivity, and basically part of what makes these sensors great is they are a probe that's designed to be inserted into a media that is wet. So we're not looking at something that's looking at measuring straight liquid water, and we're not looking at something that's measuring dry media. It's actually optimized for the ranges that we operate in as growers. And, excuse me, the main difference between the two sensors that we see is how they read EC. So with the T12, EC and volumetric water content are two very related values that are calculated based on, an electrical reading coming in. With the T1, we're able to separate those two measurements. So when we look at this exponential curve here, with the T1, we don't necessarily see that go exponential. It's much more capable of sensing that EC at a lower moisture content. That being said, when we're talking about the difference between the two, if we see this exponential increase happen as we're approaching temporary wilting point, that's already a good indicator. And then with the T1, if we had a curve that was less exponential and a little more like what we see on the T1, maybe even a little flatter, what we're looking at is, instead of always using that spike as our, indicator that we're approaching temporary wilting point, which, isn't always the case. It's just something to go look at. Like, hey, it started to spike, go check your plants. Now, instead of using this spike, we're going to look at this water line and say, hey, that's approaching 15%. That's hitting wilting point. I'm not getting the indicator necessarily from a really high EC perspective, because this sensor is better at differentiating between the two and not spiking EC at a low range. But because of where I'm at here on my water content line, I might want to start applying some more irrigation and getting that water content up. So it is important to look at what sensors you're using and figure out how to use them in operation, because whether it's a soil moisture potentiometer, T12, T1, Pulse Blue Lab, and we can name all the different sensors out there. All of them are a completely relative reading. The only way you're going to get true volumetric water content is to measure a dry pot, hydrate it, measure it again on a scale, figure out your grams of water. A gram equals a milliliter. Now you can look at what the volume of water that pot actually holds. Now, in practicality, it is incredibly expensive. And then also you have to develop a progressive model if you want to use load cells out on your benches. It'd be great to put a bunch of plants on scales, but then we have to develop a model that says, hey, we have to isolate the increase in mass every day on that plant from the actual water content that we're putting on. So long term, it becomes a lot more difficult to really keep track of like how much water am I putting on every day versus how much biomass am I building. And that's where the root zone measurements come in, because that stays consistent. We're looking at the same measurement all the time, and we're not basing it on trying to see the difference in accumulating weights, I guess is the best way I would say it. So old school technology, they did used to use load cells quite a lot in greenhouses, but again, they're very expensive. They require service. And it's a lot more sensitive to operator error, I would say, because you have that accumulating weight, and different strains are going to pack on at different times, different amount of weight every single day. So when we take it back to VWC, as long as we have an accurate reading, we can figure out that, hey, 1% VWC in a 1 gallon pot equals 37.85 milliliters. If I see a 20% drop in VWC, 20 times 37.85, I know exactly how much water to put on. Whereas if I was looking at just grams, I would have to figure out roughly how many grams of water I lost in that day, and then compensate with how many grams of plant matter did I grow during that day, which at different points of the life cycle could be reasonably significant if you're really good at growing weed.
You rock, Seth, dropping some science, but also Grummies, you're coming through with some great questions. We really appreciate it. All right, we're going to keep it moving to the next live question we got here over on YouTube. This came from Lloyd. They ask, when running generative in a 2 gallon or 1 gallon, when is the last P2 event roughly? Are you running more than 18 hours of a dry back?
Yes, more than 18 hours. In fact, in a classic generative state, the way I'd call whether I want to use a 2 gallon or a 1 gallon in my situation is during generative, whether I actually have to add a P2. So in a classic generative model, and not just classic, but what we define as the most generative, we're using only P1s to achieve field capacity, within 1 to 2 hours, a 1 to 2 hour window, usually 1 to 2 hours, ideally 2 after the lights are off. And that's just to get us, the best transpiration before we start putting that water on there. We get the most turgidity. That's when you see your plants, the leaves come up and they start, as we say, praying really hard. That means they're very much ready to take on that water and start putting it to work and building plant mass. So my advice would be start paying attention. If you have time series data monitoring and you can see what that VWC is doing in a well steered and proportional, and by that I mean great plant size to pot ratio, in that first 3 to 4 weeks we shouldn't have to put on any P2s if we don't want to. And then the next gap or the next hurdle is, hey, we go into bulking, and that's where the difference between a 2 gallon and a 1 gallon, you're going to be able to put more shots on a 1 gallon and bulk it harder. But then at the end of that, I'll go look and say, hey, my last 2 weeks or so for my ripening period, did I have to add a P2 there? And that's really where we're looking. If you had to have a P2 in your generative phase in the beginning, early flower, that means your plant's getting too big for its pot to be steered the way you might want to. And although some strains will be fine, you might find that others, if the plant outgrows the pot too quickly and you don't have a chance to pull back generative at the end and ripening, you might not get the quality you want to see out of that flower. So in this case, like I said, just try to eliminate those P2s. And if you're in the 1 gallon and you can't because the pot's drying down and you know that, hey, right before the lights go off, I can already tell. Like I look at the last few days and, that value is going lower and lower and lower. Like it's gone from, 30 to 28 to 25 to, hey, tomorrow it looks like it's going to hit 18. Okay. Then I'm looking at putting a P2 on, just a corrective shot about 2 hours before lights off. And if I could track and say, hey, I want 25% is the bottom range of my dry back goal, but this one's going to hit 18. 2 hours before lights off, I'm going to put about a 7% corrective shot on there to make sure that I'm not potentially going into that, temporary wilting point territory.
All right, Lloyd, there you go. A little bit of advice from Seth. Good luck. Thank you for your question. All right, we're going to move on to this next one. This one came from Boxwood Farmer 120. They're looking for a small overview of hydrostatic pressure versus osmotic pressure and how it's applied. You up for it?
Yeah, a little bit. Hydrostatic's not my specialty, but osmotic I know a lot about. So when we're looking at osmotic pressure, we look at the ionic concentration difference inside the root versus outside. Inside the root, we've got sugar molecules. Outside, we've got salt molecules. Both are, charged ions dissolved in water in this application. When we look at the root, generally, well, I guess I can tackle hydrostatic a little bit. When we look at the root, we're looking at, in a healthy plant, that osmotic balance between the salinity outside and the sugar it's built up inside. So if our salinity gets too high outside and we don't have enough sugar inside the root, we can't defeat that osmotic pressure. We can't pull in water and nutrients very well. And then vice versa, if we take and build up that EC in the root zone, and then the actual EC, not the EC, but the sugar content inside the roots becomes really high, and then we cut out the salinity from the root zone. Now we've got a situation where all those ions want to flow from higher to lower concentration without regulation. We see, root membrane disruption, just root death, because we have literally sugar exploding out of them into straight water because it's not being balanced by that salt. When we talk about hydrostatic stress, that's when we're getting so low in moisture content or so high that we're not able to facilitate that exchange either. So on the other, on the high end, we're not looking at a whole lot of hydrostatic pressure issues. It's just there's not enough oxygen in the root zone. Once we go down low enough to the point, like let's say in cocoa or in 15% in rock wool, maybe down to like 6%, down to 2%, we're hitting that point where we actually do hit a water pressure issue because the media is starting to hold on to the water harder, and it's taking more energy to pull water out of the media. Hydrostatic issues are something we should never approach in commercial cultivation, because as we approach that, we lose efficiency in plant growth. So that's why we talk about like temporary wilting point versus permanent wilting point. So if I'm in cocoa, and a lot of cocoa growers know this, a great amount of them use cocoa because we'd say it's more forgiving. And part of that is, hey, if I have an emitter plug up or I screw up the irrigation scheduling and I go in there, I see a few plants wilted, I can bring them back. Whereas in rock wool, if I overdry it, you see them wilted, just go cut them down. You're not going to bring them back. But that doesn't mean, just because the cocoa is more forgiving, that doesn't mean we lost efficiency and left grams on the table when that wilting point occurred. So I think that's an important thing for growers to look at is, we're trying to optimize osmotic pressure and the stress we can apply to the plant through that, never hydrostatic pressure. So, with our long drybacks, we're essentially trying to induce a drought response, kind of, but not actually go into drought response mode. We're trying to tell the plant like, hey, you're not getting rain all day, so don't grow like crazy. But you're not going down to the point where you're almost wilting and going into full drought mode where the plant is closing its stomata and trying to dramatically reduce transpiration, because anytime we reduce that transpiration amount, we're reducing biomass and oil production.
Amazing. Thank you for your overview there, Seth, but also Boxwood Farmer. Thank you for that question. It's really cool to be able to make that distinction between hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. All right, moving on. We got this one from Golden Child on YouTube. They wrote, I'm trialing out different brands of newts. A couple of them recommend no higher than 2.5 EC input. One brand even calls to reduce input if input EC goes above 20%. Above input 3 EC. They said to, and I think they mean not ever go above 6 EC for any reason. Would you recommend following company guidelines or run them like I run everything else? 6 to 10 EC in early flower, 4 to 7 EC-ish later on in flower.
So yeah, I think a good place to start here is to reel it back 10 years and let's look at what, nutrient companies were recommending, which typically was a much lower EC feed than we're going for today and pushing, more regular runoff. And part of the goal there is like, hey, you're forcibly controlling the root zone EC in that situation, and we're not pushing it super high. So it's not likely you're going to hit a point where it gets out of control. Now, once we introduce sensors to the equation, that's when we can start pushing that 3.0 to 4.0 feed and really having more root zone control. And if you want to think about how let's just say any chemical company is going to look at applying their chemicals, whether it's a fertilizer, pesticide, or herbicide, you name it, they want to have their bases covered and give you instructions that are going to give you success despite your potential lack of tools. Because when that fertilizer company makes that recommendation, they can't assume anything about how you grow your experience, what level of tools you have to actually gain insight on what's going on in your root zone. So they're always going to steer you towards a little bit more conservative input value and, probably a little bit more liberal runoff value so that you're not, letting your pH drift too much. And the idea is they want to give you a recommendation that, you're at most, they're asking you to take some runoff measurements, and otherwise they want to give you the simplest formula for success. And unfortunately, when you define success as producing a crop versus producing the optimal crop, that's where some of these recommendations kind of fall short. So in that situation, I would run that fertilizer the same way you run every other. And look at if you have root zone EC values, keep those the same, because when we talk about going into these higher PPFD and CO2 levels, we need that amount of EC. Run after run has shown that, hey, if I've got 1,200 PPFD in that room, I need a 6 to 9 baseline EC in the root zone to provide adequate nutrition to those plants, because they're essentially in overdrive compared to, let's say I used to run at 6 to 800 PPFD. Now I've got all these inputs, and that plant just needs, if I had a table that is plant production, my legs are air, how dry can I get the room to facilitate transpiration? Obviously there's a range we want to be in. How much light can I put in? How much CO2? And then how much water and nutrients? And if any one of those legs is short, the table's not going to be level, and we're not going to get great production, right? And unfortunately, EC is one of the scarier ones, because without using root zone monitoring technology for EC, basically we just have to push runoff to maintain pH and adequate nutrition. Whereas if we can watch that EC stack up in the root zone and then modulate our runoff a little bit more intelligently, we can keep that pH in range while also stacking that nutrition up and having it available for the plant in the block.
Amazing. Golden Child, that was a great question. Thank you for all of that. Good luck. Good to hear from you. All right, we're going to move it over to the Hangout. Our Grummy Carpe Drip'em dropped this question. He wants to know, what's your preferred DLI to run?
I like to approach 40. 40 is my solid point. That's getting me in the 1,000 plus PPFD range, and that's where we see max production. That being said, if you have any shortage in the other legs of your table, it's going to be difficult to run that max DLI. So there are situations like, let's say, we were talking about plant to pot ratio earlier. Let's say I did overgrow my pot, and my plant's 6 feet tall. I'm in a 1 gallon pot, and it's a big raging plant. And at 1,000 or 1,100 PPFD, it looks like I'm going to over dry it and have to start putting on P2s during ripening, like more than I want to. In that particular situation, especially if we're looking at, hey, if I can hit a certain number in quality, that's going to give me a significant premium on my price per pound. We might want to turn down the lights, slow down that transpiration a little bit, and try to, maintain our ripening strategy so that, hey, we might lose, 10 to 20% of yield max by not really optimizing growth in those last 2 weeks. But on the flip side, we got a $300 per pound premium because we were able to produce something at 28 to 30% THC versus 24 to 25 or even lower. So those are sometimes the choices we have to make. And, the biggest way to start to figure out how that impact, affects your crop is just crop registration. So looking at your irrigation strategies, looking at your yields, looking at when you made those changes and starting to draw correlations between, hey, on this strain, we ran 3 weeks of ripening and we actually saw a significant increase in THC, THCA content and terp profile compared to running it, 2 weeks or 1 week of ripening. Now we always have to balance that with, say, hey, when we ran, as much bulking as possible right till the end, maybe we did experience the best yields, but if I can't sell it, it wasn't really worth the time, right? Or if the price is so depressed, it's not, worth selling, then why did I do it? So I think that's really where for growers, and that's where it becomes tough, right? When we're trying to crank through all these strains, I used to say, at least for me, I would say, hey, it's going to take me 6 runs to dial this strain. I'm sure that there's a bunch of people out that are like, you're an amateur, you should be able to do it easier. But really, if I'm looking at commercial scale, a 2 to 5,000 plus square foot room, running a strain in that environment on maybe 2 benches, it's going to take me some time because I'm always operating in a world of averages and compromises. I can't really focus on only dialing that strain. I have to grow that basically with my standard program, see how it responds, and then start to tweak from there. And that's what's tough when you only get, like I said, I personally, I think, before having root zone sensors, 6 runs was like not something I'm super proud of, but very average in growers I talk to. Some of the people producing the best possible product are people that have been growing some of these strains for a long time and really, really dialing their environment and irrigation strategies and everything else around producing this very awesome boutique genetic. And it's just hard when you blow that up to, 5, 6, 10 strains in the same room. So with some of this root zone monitoring, we're able to start to look at what kind of trends are we seeing with different strains, what strains behave very similarly. And then also, once we can see the EC, pH, water content, we can start to rule out some of those things. Like, on the show, we talk about not flushing so much, but really the reason we say that is because when you can monitor what's actually going on in your root zone without having to, it just takes that out. If I have to basically trust that my runoff sample was accurate every day, I hit the end of my P1 without any channeling. Well, good luck getting it on the right plant because you have a dynamic population of plants. If you have 100 plants on there, there's a good chance that, a certain amount of them, depends on your uniformity, did have channeling. So if you happen to get your runoff sample from one of those, well, that's going to make it much tougher to actually run your strategy because you've got something that's not very representative of the rest of the plants. So once we can see that, we can really make choices and say, hey, this plant's locked out. Oh, well, the EC is not high, but the pH is low. So yes, effectively it is locked out, but flushing's not going to fix it for us. And that's, I think, where really having time series root zone monitoring helps growers make choices that are actually more impactful and can also, save crops. Like our goal as growers is to eventually get everything to a streamlined point where we're not being reactive, right? We know the problems we're going to hit. We know what we have to do to avoid those, and we can have clean runs. But in this world where cannabis, there's no crop insurance, at least not any affordable things that I've seen. We've got to try to be as proactive as possible because it's for your business way better to try to, start to forecast problems than it is to always be reactive because you're never going to be able to figure out what 100% of your potential in your business is if you're only ever able to operate at like 60, 70%. And that's something we're seeing with these irrigation strategies is that last 10% of polishing your environment and your irrigation is oftentimes responsible for 50 or more percent of your yields. And so that's where I think the mindset growers have to get into. There's that setup period in any business where it's just chaos and you're thrashing to get everything together and get through that first run. But then if you have the goal of stabilization in mind and a good plan, eventually you've got to figure out what your facility can do, what 100% is, so then you can start to forecast what your yields will be and plan a business around it. If my yields are fluctuating from 1.5 to 3 pounds of light and I can't tell if this next run is going to be that or not, suddenly I've got a problem with my sales and marketing department where, they don't know how much weed they're going to have to sell next month. Therefore, they can't maintain the best relationships with the dispensaries that I want them to maintain. And ultimately, I've been in that position before where we had some great contracts. Unfortunately, we had, some things go wrong. And right when things were looking great, like, hey, reputation's good. We're, our crop's sold before we ever cut it down. That next round, it won't be all sold because you'll lose some customers that were pretty bummed that you ended up, they didn't necessarily give you money ahead of time, but they planned on their shelf space and inventory to have, let's say, 5 pounds from you. And now you're giving them 2. And they go, okay, well, hey man, I measure my store inventory space in square inches. Like if you can't fill it up or if you can't sell, those are 2 reasons for me not to stock your product. And that's, compared to regular ag, anything outside of like the small organic sphere, a lot of farmers don't have to deal with that as much because they're working with distributors, and that does exist in the cannabis world as well. But we all know, like, if you want to white label and go through a broker or a distribution company, You're certainly leaving some money on the table, right, by not participating in that side of the business. And you've just got to go look at the ROI and say, hey, what if I want to distribute out of my business? Is the licensing, the personnel cost worth what it would be worth it compared to just white labeling it out and letting a different company deal distribution, knowing that I'm leaving money on the table? But hey, if I'm looking at it, I lose $100 per pound by going through that system compared to marketing my own, might not be worth it depending on the size of the business you have.
That's real talk. Crop registration, y'all. We say it almost every episode. It is your friend. Amazing, Seth. Thank you so much for that excellent overview. All right. We got this question on Instagram, changing gears a little bit, from the Real J100. They want to know what you think about low stress training and topping too soon. Bad or not?
Low stress training is a great technique that's used historically, especially among home growers. I do it because I'm not in a hurry to produce weed at home. It's a passion project, and I'm not making money on it, nor am I like running out of weed anytime soon if it's just me. That being said, when we talk about things like low stress training and topping, there's two things to look at. Topping, number one, we're looking at increasing that veg time because, hey, we top the plant. We've got to wait for it to grow a little more biomass before we flip to get the same number of nodes. And then low stress training, great. The best way to figure out your low stress training is to figure out a way to get your plants to grow up through your trellis. And the main reason I say that is both of those techniques involve labor. So when we're looking at, the production life cycle of a plant, every time a human has to touch that plant, it's costing us money. So even though it might take 2 seconds per plant to top, if I've got to go do 2,500 of them, that's now a couple hours of someone's time that I had to pay for, and that's an additional cost to the crop. Same with low stress training. So, if I'm in where I see that come out in commercial ag or commercial cannabis production mostly is like in the double stack situation where it's like, hey, we've got 4 or 5 feet from the tray to the light, and we're doing everything we can not to get the plants to grow into the light. And if I've got to go in there and tell people to tuck branches and try to do a lot of low stress training, that's where I'm really going to look at flipping a smaller plant, trying to, find a plant size and structure that grows up nicely through the trellis and hits the height that I want under the conditions that I'm growing in. Because if I have too big of a plant, that's where that low stress training comes in. And, both of them are effective at boosting yields, especially in a smaller scale, more home grow situation. But once we blow this operation up to a certain size, time is money. So if we slow down veg by a week, if we go from a 3-week to a 2-week veg by not topping, we're saving money in the veg room for those plants. They're not taking up as much square footage, light, any other resources. It's only 2/3 the amount of time. That's a significant cost savings there. And then really, I think the biggest thing we got to look at is like, hey, some of these techniques, especially the classical ones for boosting yield and stuff at home, they really were never designed to optimize a production cycle. So we're looking at like, hey, what can you do with your own 2 hands easily to boost this crop? And also, let's just talk about, GMO or some of the hazes that, or even the OGs that you talk to some old school guys are like, yeah, I'd flower those for 12, 14 weeks. Okay. Find me a commercial cannabis production manager that's going to build a business around a 14-week flower cycle. The game's just changed. That's what it is. So some of these older techniques that we all love to do, even from a perspective of like, hey, I enjoy gardening, just don't have a big place in commercial plant production. We want to optimize that growth cycle so there's as little human touching as possible, because at the end of the day, labor is always going to be expensive. And we are dealing with a commodity now. It's not, marijuana is no longer a luxury item or rare, even rare because it's illegal. Like, it's just a commodity. We have a roughly known price, and you've got to hit, check certain boxes to get above said price. So you need to do everything you can do to protect that. And then once you know that price, you work it backwards and say, okay, in my business, I know what price I can get. How can I cut costs in achieving that price with an acceptable volume? And that's one of the unfortunate things about it is, I'll always say I love cannabis because so many of the growers I work with are passionate about what they do in the plant. And sometimes you've got to really pull back on that passion and say, hey, I love this plant. I love doing all this work, but I did some math and I'm not going to make money doing it with this strain this particular way. And that I think is one of the hardest things for a lot of growers to get over is you almost skipped going from gardener to farmer to manufacturing. You almost skipped the farmer part. Unfortunately, once you get into some of these big facilities that crank over crops every week and have this high output, and you really have to balance that. And I think that's one thing that's important for people to think about as they approach, getting into commercial cultivation. I've seen a lot of, I would say, master gardeners that produce amazing product at very acceptable yields, not be able to translate that to a commercial level process. And it's not because they are unskilled or unintelligent. Often they're just driven so hard by the passion and feel so strongly that the only way to achieve those kind of results is with this meticulous, highly hands-on process. And sometimes that's true. That might be the case, but can you repeat that process at scale and still make money is the question. And oftentimes we find if you sit down and do the math, you just can't. And then, that's kind of as a grower where you decide like, hey, do I want to hop into this commercial cannabis space? Do I want to look more at, starting my own or working at a licensed micro grow? Really find your niche and what's going to make you happy, because if you are very passion driven, it's in the cannabis industry, there's different levels of money, of course, but like we're still working with a pretty highly profitable crop if you have a pretty well-run business. So you don't necessarily need to work in situations like I do with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 square foot rooms. Just look around and try to figure out like, hey, maybe I'm going to go work at this place that's a 2,000 square foot micro grow with 3 employees, and we're all super passionate, and that's how we're going to do it. And we're going to live within that revenue box. We're going to make it work. And I think that's the really hard thing is if you've been growing, let's say, with 10 lights and, you had a decent yield. That was very acceptable money for one person or 2 people coming in. Well, with the overhead that comes along with licensed growing, suddenly it just isn't. It's really, really hard to make that small business work, especially, with the different states' laws and stuff. Some states have a better program for microgrowers, and then you have Florida. That's an example. Yeah. Don't move there if you're a passionate gardener.
Oh my gosh. Oh yeah. Let me just speak to that. Yes. You got to get in where you fit in. Right.
Yeah.
I just was so surprised. Jason just logged in from Germany. Jason, can you unmute and say hi?
Hey, buddy.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm just having a pizza here and a old fashioned.
You having a German pizza?
In. Yeah, it's good.
Amazing.
Nice.
It's so good to see you. Well, you know what? Your timing is excellent. We have one more question from our Grow Me Carpe Drip'em here on the Hangout. Let's go ahead and ask it, and both of y'all can chime in. Carpe Drip'em writes, should I be worried about hollow stems? Is this from my veg environmentals or irrigation under LED? I wasn't seeing this under HPS, so I feel like I'm doing something wrong. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Hollow stems, like some genetics are just more proposed to having hollow stems. While it's not ideal, personally don't necessarily get too worried about it as long as plant growth looks healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd follow that. We're talking about there's pith autolysis, where the plant's actually consuming that pith or growing faster than its ability to create the pith in the middle of the stem. So, my first approach is to go look back at veg and making sure I'm giving those plants adequate nutrition for the amount of light that I'm giving them. And then along with those changes, just register over time. Just to what Jason said, I've run strains that it's actually a constant battle with the moms to try to get cuts without hollow stems, because that genetic is so predisposed to pith autolysis. It's a genetic trait. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes it doesn't. And it's another one of those artifact ones where over the years, breeders have selected for nose and potency and not the traits that are great for the growers. In a traditional breeding program, we'd look at that and go, hey, this one sucks. That's a bad trait. It contributes to poor rooting from the moms. It's, weak branches. We had a lot of splits. It's just not a desirable characteristic. We're going to look in the other 10,000, F2 crosses, F3, F4 that we've got in this generation and pick a better one. That's largely a result of just breeders not being able to really explore the genetic availability or variability that's present in the lines they're working with, because, hey, if you can only pop like 50 or 100 seeds at max, that's, 1% of what you want to be popping, maybe, to actually get, see what's out there in that cross. Because cannabis is dioecious and we're not self-pollinating, the amount of variability is just as big as with apples. Go to the store, get an apple, pull a seed out. If you got a Granny Smith, you are not growing a Granny Smith out of that seed. I can guarantee. And the one you grow might actually be way better. Yeah, so apples are obligate outcrossers, kind of like cannabis is not an obligate outcrosser, but in the way we grow it in a dioecious setting, we've made it outcross unless we herm it out, right? So when we get two very different genetics that cross, we have, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 phenos. Really, we've got, in that F1 cross, maybe we have 4 to 10 phenos that are all really, really similar, but slightly the same. But then we do either selective crossing within that or some synthetic breeding where we let it open pollinate. And then we might see 1,000 different phenos in that F2 generation. And a lot of times if we weren't able to take it to that and really look at that, variability and level of expression, there's probably things in there that we don't even know exist. Yeah, your winner might be there and it might be way different than either of the parents and just totally weird and awesome. But if you couldn't pop, enough seeds to find it, never makes it out.
Wow. Well, nature's always in charge. Amazing. Carpe drip, and we appreciate your question. Thank you for that. Well, before we go, Jason, you want to tell the world what you're doing in Germany?
Yeah, we're just here at Mary Jane in Berlin. So if you're over here, come see us in our booth. We're all going to be set up tomorrow. I think 11 a.m. starts local time, and just looking for a great show. We get excited about meeting prospects over here in Europe, and we're going to just keep pushing Arroyo.
Yeah, this
go
is
take
exciting.
Jason out and show him a good time. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, have so much fun, Jason. Take lots of pictures. And yeah, if y'all are anybody out there that's in Berlin for the Mary Jane show, Arroyo will be there June 14th through the 16th. We've got a booth. Head over to booth E88, and go say hi. That's it. Jason, have an amazing trip. And thank you for stopping by the pod today. It's always good to have the whole team. We miss you already. And then, of course, Seth, thank you for holding it down solo. Producer Chris, I could not do this without you. Thank you for another great session. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this week's Arroyo Office Hours. To learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io, and our team will show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have any crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, drop them anytime in the Arroyo app. Email us at sales@arroyo.io. Send us a DM over Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We want to hear from you. Don't fear not. If your question wasn't picked, resubmit it. We also have a great bank. We will get to it. And if you're a fan of the pod, please leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your feedback, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Thanks, y'all. See you at episode 107. Bye.